Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Horus Heresy lore breakdown, where we are still on book number 19, as being the second part, where the first loyalist kill on Calth has just been made by an Imperial army soldier. When the heathen auxiliaries of the word-bearers broke through the fencing and began butchering the Imperial army elements, one of them, an officer, had just about enough wits about him to pull out his pistol and actually shoot one of the crazy bastards. Not much in the way of a KD so far, but hey, it's a start. And not far behind him comes Guilliman as well, not with an actual kill, that's still some way off, but he does order the remaining forces of Ultramar to actively defend themselves against the word-bearers up to and including return of fire. The Mark of Calth is then officially started, although as of yet there is still no way to actually communicate these orders to the rest of the fleet, and so it is a mere technicality at this point. Of course, down upon the ground, the fighting has already begun. The Ultramarines companies that have been attacked by the word-bearers and Titan elements as well, just, for good measure, has already suffered catastrophic casualties and are retreating and trying to reorganize whatever they can, whilst fighting back against the now seemingly unstoppable world-bearers. World-bearers. That's new. I didn't even manage to mistake them for one or the other. I combined both of them. Good job, brain. Good job. Hoping to keep the names in order, let us move on now, because quite a lot of interesting things happen quite quickly. One of the first and foremost one is the perspective of a word-bearer. He's talking about how he needs to execute this campaign on Calth properly, because he wants to ascend the ranks, not just in the, physical way, but in the metaphysical way as well, and grow higher in the gods' esteem. And he mentions Lorgar here, which I find rather amusing, because again, my video on Lorgar, my key point is Lorgar was always evil. Lorgar was not manipulated into this, he wasn't tricked into this, he wasn't dragged kicking and screaming into being a monster. Lorgar was always a monster. He was merely looking for a reason to justify his actions. And now, we see yet further clarification on that. Before this, he mentions that, not Lorgar, but the word-bearer's captain, I believe, he mentions that Erebus and Corferon had been the ones deepest in the mysteries, the ones with the most knowledge, the most experience, and with the most power in their new magical arts. However, Lorgar is apparently superseding them. He is throwing himself wholeheartedly into this mystery, and he uses a word which I really like. He states that Erebus and Corferon are no longer adept. That's a wonderful word used to describe this, because it suggests that Lorgar is adept. Lorgar doesn't merely understand, he doesn't merely know the things, he doesn't read from an old dusty tome or recite passages or rituals. The power flows through him. He just wields it, he carves it, he shapes it naturally, as if it was what he was born to do, as if he was adept at it. And Erebus and Corferon are trying to catch up. The sacrifice of Calth's son is going to be the next step in that. The killing of the Ultramarines, the killing of Reboot Guilliman, all of this is supposed to be their next step on the ladder towards daemonhood. And Lorgar, of course, knows that as well, and there's a reason why the word-bearer elements on Calth are somewhat smaller than one might potentially have expected them to be. But that's a topic for another book. It is nevertheless very interesting that Lorgar is so, again, like I said, Lorgar, he was always a monster. No matter what his protestations, no matter his complaints, his wailing, woe is me, his actions prove the lie. Absolutely. They also mention that a lot of the Imperial army, or the heathen militia regiment, shall we say, that the word-bearers have picked up, they consider themselves immortals. One of them in particular thinks that if he's killed, he will be brought back. That was the promise the wordbearers gave him, that they have gene tech to replicate them. Now, this is bullshit. Almost certainly, this is bullshit. But it does make for wonderfully fanatical soldiers, doesn't it? Soldiers willing to walk straight into machine gun fire. After all, if they think they'll be brought back, well, no reason not to, eh? It's a bit of a petty parlor trick, perhaps, but hey, if it works, it works. And speaking of parlor tricks, Lorgar's attempt, or more probably Corfedon or Erebus's attempt to veil their assault, has also finally been revealed by Guilliman, who rescinds his offer of a ceasefire and instead calls up Lorgar, telling him all the things he's going to do with him, and Lorgar just teases him. I don't even know if this is Lorgar. Again, the way he speaks here is so very different to how I would expect Lorgar to speak. He speaks aggressively, with malice, with hatred. He's mocking Guilliman, and honestly, with Lorgar's persona, I would expect him to be more haughty, more condescending, like, oh, you never could see, dear brother, you know? But then, the link is cut, and a demon appears on the bridge, making me think that it was the demon that Guilliman was speaking to all along, and that Lorgar was never even in system, and that he had never spoken with Guilliman during this entire incursion. Interesting idea. The demon then appears and goes, boof, blowing out the entire goddamn bridge and giving us one of those, oh my god, is Guilliman dead moment? Of course he isn't. There are a dozen more books with him in them that we already pretty much know of at this point. Authors need to stop trying to do this. Stop trying to pull off the like, oh, he wasn't actually dead. Yeah, we know. This trick has been used a little bit too often. But hey, it's neat, I suppose. And the whole demon appearing on the bridge and the bridge officer, Guilliman, just kill the link. And the bridge officer going, oh, link's already cut, sir. That's a little cute. That's a little cute, if nothing else. And then John Grammaticus appears. Not next to Guilliman, of course, but speaking to Pius, we'll just call him that, somebody who's already on Calth, a perpetual, a proper perpetual, not artificial like Grammaticus, a real-life perpetual. The perpetuals, too, are an odd thing, because it is suggested quite often that the Emperor is one, but clearly being a perpetual does not give you the kind of power that the Emperor has, so it's a little bit up and down there. John Grammaticus, however, has apparently shifted his allegiance quite drastically. He basically starts the conversation by saying he is going to lose. And it's like, who's going to lose? Who do you think is going to lose? He's going to lose, and if he loses, humanity loses. Grammaticus has figured out what the Cabal is planning, and he doesn't agree with it. He wants to rescue humanity. He doesn't care about the galaxy anymore. He doesn't care about the high and mighty goals of the Cabal, if you can call them high and mighty. He wants to save humanity, and therefore he's sending Pius off on a little journey to do whatever it is he can do, to face whatever it is he must face, to try and shift the balance of power ever so slightly. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. First and foremost, Grammaticus has turned. Right. That might throw into a little bit more, light, shall we say, the apparent about-face of the Alpha Legion as well, because we know that they know about John Grammaticus. And it wouldn't be too surprising if the two had had a little bit of contact and decided that maybe, just maybe, this whole Cabal idea isn't quite all that it's made out to be. And secondly, too, Pius mentions that he sees the Emperor, he sees the final fight, he sees Sanguinius dead on the floor, he sees Horus standing over him, pure evil, just complete and absolute destruction made manifest, suggesting possibly also that the Cabal's plans would not have worked out, maybe, but That's leaping to a bit too much in the way of conclusions right there. And he then mentions the Emperor. He sees his light diminished, as if he's in despair, basically. He sees where this is going, he knows what's going to happen next, and it's pretty shit. But there is no choice but to go through with it now. And Pius describes the Emperor's light as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. I find that interesting again because this guy is a perpetual. Like, he would see the Emperor and not necessarily see the glamour. He would see him as a perpetual, as John Grammaticus did. So I'm assuming it provides some kind of immunity, maybe? Who knows? It's a little bit confused, because Grammaticus described the Emperor as glamour, but also that he could see through it and have a conversation with him, and that the Emperor also recognized John Grammaticus on sight as a perpetual. There's clearly some kind of link between all of these characters that we haven't quite seen yet. It is very interesting, though, to see these forces start turning in favor of the Emperor, suggesting once again that fate is not quite as set as the Cabal makes it out to be. Again, I think the fucking Eldar are making shit up again. I guess we'll see a little bit more when the Alpha Legion rear their ugly, duplicitous heads again at some point in the future. Meanwhile, the Ultramarines are slowly but surely trying to begin the process of rallying and organizing some form of a fighting force. Down on the planet, a couple of Ultramarine leaders have run into some Skitarii, which are currently trying to get a hold of some kind of data engine capable of wresting control back of the Calth main weapon grid, which at this point has been hijacked via some of the smaller computers, which have been hijacked by the word bearers in orbit. Which, once again, makes me ask the question, why aren't these computers everywhere and easily accessible by the Ultramarines with failsafe codes? Or hell, even just self-destructs, but details. The Skitarii are looking for an alternative data engine to, again, try and take over control. They mentioned the scrap code could be a problem, but they also state that any engine that has been offline would have been isolated from the scrap code. Again, backups. It would seem to have been a logical thing, but oh well. Anywho, there's apparently one in the governor's office, a ancient piece that has been kept offline for absolute ages because, well, nobody really figured they'd be needing it now that the new fancy data engines are online. They also now have limited secure vox via the Skitarii's hardened military networks, which the Ultramarines use to contact what they believe to be a larger formation of Ultramarines trying to gather up their forces. Meanwhile, they order this formation to head towards the governor's palace as they themselves head towards it with scattered Ultramarines, remnants, and of course the Skitarii and any Imperial army elements they can come across. In orbit, Guilliman's flagship is invaded by demonic monstrosities, which has apparently managed to spring out through practically the entire ship. Whatever that creature went kablooey over apparently opened up some kind of minor warp rift as well. Thiel, upon realizing that monsters were roaming the halls, decided to raid the Primarch's weapon collection. The balls on the bastard. And launch a counterattack trying to secure the ship, heading naturally for the bridge, where he explains his practical and theoretical that, the demons are rescending, but the word bearer is about to be boarding us with 3 massive ships, so he figured we might as well fight them with something unconventional, e.g. the Primarch's weapon collection. So this is also where we get to hear that Thiel was marked for censor for running theoreticals against other legionnaires, and this was considered treasonous, which it absolutely would have been, no doubt about it. And he basically is the only Ultramarine today that has any real understanding of how they might effectively engage the enemy, because as he so pertinently points out, Guilliman has been making his writings on combat available to anyone who wants them, and so the Ultramarines' ways of making war will be well known to the word bearers, or, well, they could have been well known to the word bearers, but in the words of Corferon, Guilliman writes an awful lot but very little of substance, so whether or not they're actually read any of it, I'm not entirely sure about that, but, theoretical is still sound. But even as the Ultramarines are rallying and beginning to calmly and coldly analyze the situation, with a degree of butthurt, to be sure, but vengeful butthurt, so, directed and focused butthurt, the word-bearers are actually heading in the completely opposite direction. They have executed their treachery with complete and utter surprise, and considerable lethality as well. There was absolutely no hesitation on their behalf when it came to murdering their once brethren, and they made the absolute most of the shock and awe effect of this sudden betrayal. But as the Ultramarines are beginning to gather, once again, as mentioned, Captain Ventanus is bringing Ultramarines to the Governor's Palace to get a hold of a cogitated system to perhaps wrest control back of the orbital weapons grid, which is currently used by the word-bearers in orbit to annihilate a forge station nearby and then being shot at the sun. Why they wouldn't use it to just execute the rest of the Ultramarines' fleet? I mean, there is a mention that they are trying to capture as much of the fleet as possible, which, I mean, on the one hand, I understand the strategic necessity to try and seize the enemy's fleet, especially one of this size, armament, and armor. After all, a destroyed spaceship is technically worth nothing, whereas a captured spaceship is worth everything, but this is the Ultramarines Legion they're fighting here. About 70-80% of the Legion under the command of their Primarch. Now, they might assume that they'd managed to assassinate Guilliman, but that too would be a dangerous assumption in and of itself. I honestly think, this is one of the things I'm talking about here, so actually, let's move on down to the surface for a second again to resume the point somewhat. Whilst the Ultramarines are beginning to rally, Ventanus gets in contact with an amalgamation of several companies that were at the Erad Muster, one of the largest gathering formations, and he has given them a passcode so that they can identify them from the enemy. The Ultramarines have been asked to specify the number of the painted Eldar, which is a good question actually, considering the solution to it is rather neat, but we'll get to that in a little bit. They then reach the Governor's Palace, and they are contacted by forces who claim to be from the Erad Muster. They claim to be Ultramarine troops seeking shelter. Immediately, however, Ventanus is a bit skeptical of this. It's too obvious, it's too simple, and so he gives them the passcode, the number of the painted Eldar, and they don't understand. They ask if the Eldar have been sighted within the battle zone. And so Ventanus opens fire upon what is correctly traitor forces. This begins quite the big old battle for the Governor's Palace, and this is where the word-bearers make a potentially fatal mistake. One of their formations claims to have found a sizable grouping of Ultramarines defending this compound, and he makes the argument to his superiors that he should be allowed to detach his formation to pursue this because he assumes the Ultramarines are there for a specific reason, which they are, but not for a reason that would win them the battle, really. The Cogitator is not powerful enough to wrest control back of the grid, and at best it would give them limited Vox capabilities. Meanwhile, this is several company-sized formations that are turned off here, and they will turn out to be a somewhat unfortunate weakening of a word-bearer assault later on. The word-bearers are already starting to basically assume that the Ultramarines are a defeated foe, and that they can simply just exterminate them as they wish. They are no longer prioritizing the kill. Instead of simply obliterating the Governor's Palace from orbit, which they absolutely could have, they instead determined that it would be best to shave off elements of a primary assault. They are dividing their attention, they're dividing their focus, and this is probably happening all across the battlefield. There is even mentions later on about word-bearers specifically seeking close quarters combat, even when they will have to expose themselves to do so and suffer greater casualties than necessary. The word-bearers are already convinced that they have won, and they are starting to make stupid decisions and take unnecessary risks because they figure they have nothing to lose. But on the other hand, they have everything to gain. And this is the most important detail. The word-bearers are now serving a very different master than the Imperium or even their own legion. Advancement within the legion now is carried out more on the basis of favor, occult knowledge, and of course the notice of their new masters and deities, rather than the usually strictly defined series and ranks upon which the old legion was based. Promotion is no longer a matter of skill or demonstration of superior tactical acumen or combat prowess. It is all about who you know and what knowledge you might leverage to get those acquaintances. And of course, the very people who you are also trying to befriend to rise up the ladder, they're painfully aware of this as well. They rose up the ladder the very same way, and so they are going to be very, very suspicious of any new overly ambitious underlings. This, of course, creates an atmosphere of not competition, but rather jealousy, mistrust, and abuse, honestly. When everybody is trying to get their own in any way they can, and they no longer really operate via the strictly defined rota of the old legion, it's everyone versus everyone. Everyone is trying to get whatever little advantage they can over everyone else. For a regular foot soldier, that will involve charging the Ultramarine lines with an anathema, to gather up sacrifices, to make a show of himself in the eyes of the gods, and carry out great feats of martial prowess. For the commanders, it's all about enriching themselves, gaining pieces of occult knowledge, or committing the greatest atrocities in the names of their new deities. And so you will see, as in this example, a captain spotting glory and then wanting to go for it, whereas the guys up the chain of command, they're hesitant to enforce discipline, because it could earn them enemies they could ill afford, and it's also a very practical idea as well. Okay, if this guy breaks off and he defeats the Ultramarines, good, I can take credit for that as his superior, as the one who gave him permission. If he breaks off and is defeated, none of my business. That simply just proved that he was incompetent for doing this, and I already told him, if you want to go pursue this, on your head be it. There is very little to lose in terms of internal power politics for the commander. But of course, strategically, again, there is everything to lose. This is somewhat exemplified in the attempt to capture Guilliman's flagship. Now, of course, the word-bearers assume that they've essentially crippled the warship, and they've also got the weapons grid up and operational under their control. In case the warship moves, they can theoretically just blast it to smithereens. They are also assuming that they have successfully assassinated Guilliman and the command staff on the bridge. These are, however, an awful lot of assumptions, and the safe thing to do would simply be to obliterate this ship at the very least. There is absolutely a logical reason why the word-bearers are trying to seize as many vessels as they can. They're trying to increase their own status within the heresy. They're trying to increase their own fleet size, and, again, even more importantly, Corferon and Erebus now know that they are not... They don't consider themselves the subjects of Lorgar anymore. They consider themselves to be in competition with Lorgar, and therefore, gathering whatever military might they can outside of his influence is once again of paramount importance. But trying to seize Guilliman's flagship, again, as a symbol, it is of unrivaled importance. The desecrations, the offerings they could give up on a Primarch's flagship, and possibly with the body of the Primarch itself, that would garner them immense quantities of favor with their new gods. But think about the risk they are taking here. They are assuming they've got the flagship locked down. They are assuming they've assassinated Guilliman. They are assuming they can seize the flagship. They're committing 3 cruisers to this, and none of them are firing. If the flagship was to be retaken by the Ultramarines, if it was to shake off the influence of the scrap code, and if they were for any reason to lose control of the weapons grid, then the Ultramarines flagship would not only be in the perfect position to execute 3 word-bearer cruisers, he would also become a symbol of resistance, the phoenix rising from the ashes with Guilliman at the head. That is an awfully large risk to take when you are fighting an enemy that you have absolutely got on the back foot. Pushing him over the edge would have been the correct choice, but instead, the word-bearers relent. They prioritize favor and glory over finishing off the enemy. And so, whilst they've brought a considerable force to batter the provincial governor's palace, more than enough to potentially overrun it if they were to simply assault it en masse, they instead spend their time toying with the Ultramarines. They send in their heathen auxiliary regiments. They poke and prod at the walls. They don't bring up their super heavy armor reserves until the very end, when they feel like they've perhaps exhausted the Ultramarines enough. There's no killer instinct in the word-bearers anymore. And by the time they finally are deploying their heaviest assets, Vantanus gets a call over the Vox that gives him the number of the Painted Eldar, of which there were 12. Vantanus then responds that, as anyone will tell you, there were 13. It was a trick question. This confirms to him that the Ultramarines coming this time are actually Ultramarines. Confirmed shortly thereafter, as the remnants of several Ultramarines companies with the 4th company at their head, Vantanus' own formation, hammers into the flanks of the word-bearers and destroys a force 3 times their size in a matter of hours. And make no mistake, there is absolutely no way a ragtag formation of Ultramarines should be able to do this. We can certainly heap a great deal of question upon the word-bearers' individual combat prowess as compared to their Ultramarine cousins, especially considering the forces sent to Calth were not the best and the brightest amongst the word-bearers. But again, this is a ragtag, poorly organized, ad hoc formation that comes across a unit of many times its size and yet manages to trounce it so completely and utterly as to shatter the word-bearers. The only way this could have happened is if the word-bearers simply assumed that there was no way it could happen. They didn't deploy any auxiliaries, they didn't deploy any guards, any skirmishers, any early warning systems. They simply assaulted what was right in front of them with no care whatsoever as to what could be all around them. And this, in the end, is what's going to cause the word-bearers so much trouble. Starting, of course, with the fact that Guilliman is not dead. Shocking surprise, I know. It's like, oh no, Guilliman's been shot into space. He's surely dead. Looks at all of the future books planned. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. Back on the flagship, the Ultramarines are beginning to prepare for a counterattack. They've seized control over the flagship again, defeated the demons who are receding, and are now trying to figure out what to do about the 3 word-bearer cruisers latched to their hull. And it is in the midst of trying to deal with this that they rediscover Guilliman. He has been wandering outside and the literal hull of his flagship, which apparently still maintains some form of light atmosphere, which I'm not entirely sure. Theoretically speaking, it's not impossible for that to happen if you have a large enough item and, there's leaks of air and ventilation and all kinds of shit, possibly, but you'd think that just regular space travel or moving through the void would quickly disperse this, but I mean, again, and if these ships are producing a artificial gravity, then once again, it is possible. It's just, I don't know. I feel the physics of this is a little bit perhaps iffy, but hey, details. Guilliman is alive and he's murdering word-bearers who have been silly enough to come outside of their own ships, attempting to connect boarding hatches essentially over to the capital ship to allow for the easier transfer of troops. Guilliman is a bit angry, as you might probably expect, but he is convinced to come back inside and instead lead La Resistance. Meanwhile, down on the planet, Erebus is preparing for the last steps in his ritual to sacrifice the sun, and this is where a rather interesting... this is something that could mean something, which could also simultaneously mean absolutely nothing. He speaks of the various demons that are being summoned, the skin of reality is growing thin as he tries to breach the veil and sacrifice the sun, giving it up to his unclean deities. And he speaks about how he sings to the demons surrounding him, which is an interesting idea. Again, these demons, to him, at this point in time, Erebus probably views the demons less as threats or monsters or the dangers that they so absolutely are, and he views them more probably like just byproducts, something to be exploited, basically. The word-bearers in particular, I think, view the gods certainly as object of worship, to be sure, but again, you gotta look at how the word-bearers approach the idea of worship to begin with. For them, it's not really so much a deity or something sacred necessarily, as it is something that will allow them to justify their own beliefs, their own actions, their own view of the world, really, rather than God in the more traditional sense. At least that seems to be how they are treating them. But anyway, enough about the esoterical. The interesting part is he says he knows their names and he sings to them gently. Alright? Creepy, but not necessarily anything special. However, he then lists a series of names, and one of them is Tariq, he who is now Torgarden. Tariq Torgarden, the friend of Garvia Loken from the Lunar Wolves. Huh. Interesting. Now, there is mention of, he's of course dead as far as we know, killed by, not Abaddon, he was killed by, Little Horus, wasn't he, if my memory serves. Perhaps his body was then sacrificed or devoured or offered up in some way and has now been possessed by a demon entity. And that is why there is now a demonic entity drawn to Calth, a warp creature that has adopted the name of Tariq and that hasn't quite understood, Tariq Torgarden. He doesn't quite figure out, why are there two names? There's some kind of significance in this, and so he is now Tariq, who is Torgarden. Possibly. I feel like this is a bit of a plot hook, perhaps, for further down the road. We shall wait and see. Alternatively, I might also have just kind of forgotten about this. I feel like... I don't know, I feel like there is something demon nonsensey I'm supposed to be remembering here, but we shall see. Back in the Ultra Smurf camp, Guilliman has come back aboard and, more importantly, inside his capital vessel, and has begun trying to prepare a theoretical strategy. He does not believe that they can defeat the Wordbearers, but at the very least he would like to hurt them before they have to wander off to their eternal slumber. Somewhat pessimistic of the Papa Smurf, but at least he's trying something. There's also where he mentions that it feels as if the Edict of Nicaea threw away their one and only truly effective weapon against the demons, and that he wishes to petition for it to be removed as soon as possible, which is of course a very smart thing for him to do. He also speculates that it seems as if someone was trying to engineer this from the start, which is partially true. The Edict of Nicaea was more of a dum-dum move. One of those that, even now, it doesn't entirely quite make sense, but, oh well, details. It happened, and Guilliman wishes to overturn it. Although, interestingly enough, he's not at the point where he would just say, fuck it, and just cancel it out of hand with his own authority. Which, On the one hand, I guess he technically couldn't do that, and on the other hand, I'm absolutely sure that he could do that, because, well, at the end of the day, he is a Primarch, and that gives him pretty considerable powers of interpretation when it comes to the Emperor's edicts. But at the same time, too, the Order was fairly clear and not particularly open to interpretation, so I can see both sides of that particular argument. He also talks about his supposedly lost brothers. The word-bearers have told him that several of the Primarchs are dead at this point, Ferrus Manus being one of them. This strikes Guilliman particularly hard, because he's always maintained that if he could link up with one of the dauntless few, such as the Blood Angels, the Fists, or the Iron Hands, he could win any war. And out of these, Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands were the most reliable out of the bunch, stating that once you had Ferrus Manus at your side, you could rely on him to never break. Unfortunately, there was also a little bit of a problem. That was kind of what led to Ferrus Manus dying in the first place. The fact that once he'd made up his mind to go and try and get some sort of revenge, there was absolutely no stopping him, regardless of how suicidal that revenge very clearly was. Guilliman also further orders all of the veterans that will be taking charge of the counterattack to paint their helmets red, partially as a way to easily distinguish who is in charge in this situation where reliable vox is not necessarily guaranteed in any way, shape, or form, and also because after the actions of Thiel, and of course he's theoretical on how to defeat the Legiones Astartes, Guilliman decides that the red helmet should no longer be a mark of censor. This was... I think I mentioned this already, but I really like this part. It's one of those really... Way too many authors try to do a little bit of a aha thing, where they're like, oh, this is why this thing is this way, and it comes across as a little bit forced and unnatural. But this, again, it makes perfect sense. Red as a color of censor... Absolutely, I can see what that'd happen. It's a nice bright color, it would make you stick out. Within a legion like the Ultramarines, where discipline and uniformity is all, having your helmet painted a bright red scarlet color would be a clear sign to everyone that you done fucked up. And also, the idea of public shame is... another thing that I think the Ultramarines would subscribe to rather wholeheartedly. And again, Guilliman then being too like, well, you know, this is an obvious way to distinguish people, and considering the only guy who saw this coming was the guy with the red helmet, makes sense to honor him by turning the helmet into a mark of honor. A really cool touch. Another neat one comes down on the planet where Captain Ventanus is rallying the defenders of the Governor's Palace, now reinforced by elements of the 4th Company under his command, and several other formations as well. He has just defeated a demon who inhabited the dead flesh of a wordbearer who had allowed himself to be captured. He claimed that he allowed himself to be captured to give the Ultramarines one last chance, to be taken into the fold, to be allowed to see the truth. Very kind, very gentle of him. Of course, the real reason was that he wanted to taunt the Ultramarines into killing him in their midst so that his flesh could become host to a demon. And the demon in this case is an old familiar one of ours, Samus. Unfortunately, this time he's a bit more of a pussy and gets murdered pretty much instantly by Ventanus, who uses one of the ritual anathema that he's picked up to slay it in pretty much one hit. Another Ultramarine sees this and goes, it's a pretty good idea. So he goes around to all of the dead word bearers, all of which have their own anathema. Probably as some part of a bonding ritual, I would imagine. You know, binding them all together under the auspices of their new gods. And he's gathered them all in a sack and brings them to Ventanus, saying like, hey, look, I found all these shiny things. You used one. They seem pretty effective. Maybe we should use them to stab other demons as well, seeing as, you know, they're kind of powerful. They kill like 5 of us in 5 seconds, so maybe. But Ventanus is surprisingly far ahead of his time at this point. The Ultramarines' idea is basically theoretical. Their weapons work, let's use their weapons. But he states, yeah, their weapons works, but we don't know enough about it. And he also got a rather nasty sensation from the thing when he picked it up. So he presents a counter-theoretical. This is how it began with the Word-Bearers. They met an enemy that they couldn't kill, or was at the least resistant to the more usual forms of beating things to death, and then they found daggers deep inside some Xenos temple, and they went, oh, well, these works, so let's use them, not understanding that by utilizing the weapons of the enemy, they were opening themselves up to manipulation and corruption. Now, I don't think Ventanus has quite fully understood just how correct he is, but considering his limited understanding at this point, this is a damn good decision from him. Perhaps you could argue that it would also be a bit of an overly cautious thing, since he doesn't actually know anything about this, but, well, we know a thing or two about these things, and yes, remarkably prescient, absolutely. And Ventanus's contribution to the Ultramarine fight back does not end there. He also gets in contact with Guilliman once again, re-establishing the Vox link using the cogitator in the palace's basement. It is powerful enough to organize limited secure Vox on the planet, but not quite enough to reach all the way into orbit and re-establish a new sphere, a full detailed informational uplink. However, it is the only source of active and accurate encrypted secure data currently available to the Ultramarines on the planet, and so despite its somewhat limited potential, it is still by far the most valuable intelligent assets the Ultramarine has. And it has also allowed the server to discover the source of the weapons grid control, the scrap code, and how to kill it. She has managed to rediscover a kill code created by the old server, Hest, before his passing. This will allow her to defeat the scrap code and wrest control of the weapons grid back away from the Word-Bearers, or at the very least just taking control away from them and then turning it onto a neutral mode, since the server in the basement is not powerful enough to run it. However, if they can get access to a server powerful enough and clear it of scrap code, they may actually be able to resume full control. This is a mission that is now uploaded to Guilliman, or at the very least, they try to get it to Guilliman. They get the basic facts, they have the capabilities of neutralizing or potentially seizing control of the weapons grid, they have the kill code, they are uploading data to Guilliman's flagship, and they are just about to tell him what the target is when the Vox from the surface goes dead. Guilliman, now knowing that literally the entire goddamn battle is going to rest on the correct identification of this one target, does what Guilliman does, and autism sets into being. He literally just goes through every single cogitator currently operational, all of the damage done, all of the ship's damage done, what he cannot attack, all of this in a matter of basically seconds, and comes up with the correct target, because Guilliman. And honestly, this is how you should do Primarchs, because on the one hand, it is goddamn impressive that he can do this, and at the same time, it's not an impossibility. This is a mathematical question. It is a logical question. It is a realistic question. It's not like just, raising your hand in the air and going, right, well, the wind seems to be coming from this particular direction, therefore that's where the cogitator is. I really do like this. Now, there is still quite a little bit of book left, and the end here is a little bit interesting, so I was thinking maybe I just do this an extra long one, but I think the last part is deserving of a third part, so I'm going to let you wait for that another day. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon with the third and final part of the Battle for Calth. Have a good day.